This week on Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, we speak with Patrick Deneen about the ambiguities inherent in the American founding, about the differences between progressive liberalism, classical liberalism, Marxism, and conservatism, and how our elites mask their eliteness. Let's go. Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers, a podcast on philanthropy and civil society. I am Jeremy Beer. It's great to have you with us. We are recording on April 16, 2025, and I'm excited to have as our guest author and political philosopher Patrick Deneen. Patrick is a repeat guest on the show. We had him on a few years ago, I think shortly after his book, Why Liberalism Failed, was published. That book has since gone on to become one of the most talked about, influential, beloved, or reviled books to be published this century. I think it's fair to say. And it's one of those books that, in fact, just changed the conversation and that a lot of people talk about without having actually read it. It's sort of the closing of the American mind book of our time, Patrick. I believe that's the case.
Praise indeed.
Yeah, it is high praise. And then in 2023, Patrick followed up Why Liberalism Failed with Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future over my shoulder here. So we're going to talk mostly about that book here today. We'll also talk about how, in Patrick's view, we ought to understand the founding as we approach his favorite word, the semi-quincentennial.
I'm going to have to practice. Thanks.
All right. For those who don't know, Patrick is professor of political science and David A. Potenziani Memorial Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to coming to South Bend, he taught at Princeton and Georgetown. And one more thing you should know about Patrick is that he loves living in the great state of Indiana, especially in April when it's still, 35 degrees outside or whatever it is right now.
If I showed you outside, you'd see that I'm not living in the state of Indiana at the moment.
Because that's true. I forgot you're in Colorado at the moment.
70 degrees. Yeah, I'm in Boulder, Colorado this year. So I do love living in Indiana, but I'm kind of appreciating not being there right now.
Boulder in April, probably a little bit better than South Bend.
We're going to snow later this week, but that just means skiing season's been extended just a little longer.
Yeah, not too bad.
Yeah.
So, well, hey, thanks for joining us, Patrick. Appreciate you having you on. As I said, we talk after every major book. I think that's sort of the rule here.
Right.
Let's talk about regime change. I thought about this when I read the first line of the book. There was only a generation ago or so, maybe, that Alistair McIntyre, the philosopher, proclaimed, "We are all liberals now." You begin regime change with the sentence, "Liberalism has generated its own undoing." So I think that serves pretty well as the premise of your entire intellectual project, seems to me. So let's start there. Situate us. In what sense has liberalism generated its own undoing?
Yeah, that line was meant as a very brief recapitulation of the previous book.
Previous book in 5 words.
Summarize the previous book in a brief amount of time as possible, and that seemed to be a sentence that more or less functioned. So I don't necessarily want to revisit the entire argument of why liberalism failed, but as you well know, since you were an early adopter and indeed title recommender for that book.
Well, let's be clear. We said this before, but let's be clear. If you had adopted my title idea, the book would have been a major failure.
The book would have failed. Yeah.
The book would have failed. Why this book failed?
What it was, but it was pretty close.
My title recommendation was "Why America Failed." For those,
okay, you just said
not a great idea.
Fortunately, my better judgment prevailed.
Yes, indeed.
We'll see. That may be the title of the next book. We'll see.
I hope not.
Yeah, no, me too. So that sentence was meant to convey essentially that the thesis of why liberalism failed, which was in some ways a kind of proleptic thesis. It was this: these are the ways that the failure of liberalism is now clearly visible to even those who admire and support liberalism, which I'm not among that party. And so many people realize, yes, this is, or recognize that, yes, this is describing trajectories or tendencies within liberalism that the more, in a sense, the more it becomes itself, or the more it succeeds in and I'm describing it as almost a living creature, but in the
Right.
same that Plato or Tocqueville, to name two of my favorite thinkers, uh, they both describe the internal logic of a regime.
Right.
So it's not doing the thing; it's a kind of
Yeah.
its own commitments
Hmm.
unfold over time. And of course, it's not
Yeah.
inevitable, but there are strong
Right.
tendencies. In this
Right.
case, liberalism,
Right.
its unfolding or its trajectory, in its internal logic, leads to a kind of undoing of the basic features that you could say human lives require for flourishing. And I
Hmm.
think, in some ways, to anticipate our discussion of the founders,
Yeah.
things that our founders assumed would continue to persist, but under the logic of liberalism, things like family, things like civil society, community,
Hmm.
church,
Hmm.
even nation,
Hmm.
and confidence in the nation, all have dissipated in just an accelerating fashion over the last number of
Hmm.
years. So when I sat down to write Regime Change after, after the that book had been, digested, discussed, it was really kind of writing at the tail end of what now people recognize was, yeah, okay, it's we can all agree that liberalism, whatever we think of it, is in deep and dire
Yeah.
crisis, and
Yeah.
we need, and in some ways, an openness to thinking maybe there's something that follows liberalism. Hence the term that I'm not entirely satisfied with, but the term or the
Hmm.
phrase or the word post liberalism is
Post
the kind of
liberal.
placeholder. Yeah.
What are the major symptoms of liberalism failing for people who might kind of be catching up on this? Is it the rise of nationalism and populism, as they're often called? Is it declining, even things, health, mental, illness, anxiety? Those things are increasing. I meant declining. I was going to say lifespan. Even are these sort of some of the, of course, the crumbling of the family, thin communities. Am I on the right track here? Is this what you're thinking about? You're thinking about the failure of
Yeah.
liberalism?
Well, I think when you mention something like nationalism, or
Yeah.
populism, I would see that as reactions against, in a sense, the failure or the success of liberalism. So I
Yeah.
would regard,
Yeah.
in some ways, the things that people are, maybe liberals today, right liberals, left liberals, are decrying as the rise of
Mhm.
Trumpism or, um, uh, kind of the populist movements around the world today. These are responses, kind of the ill body politic, almost
Mhm.
immune
Mhm.
responses to a
Mhm.
system that's quite sick. And so, yeah, I would say, in kind of the two large buckets by which we often evaluate politics, on the economic side of things, we've seen this period of globalization, of the kind of the tearing down of boundaries and borders, the sense that there's any such thing as a national economy. Of course, the accelerating deindustrialization of the American heartland. Both of us know that all too well from where we come
Mhm.
from. The resulting, kind of, let's say, massive pooling of wealth in certain parts of the country, certain cities of the country,
Yeah.
while the rest of the country, or large parts of our country that once were not necessarily wealthy, but were broadly, I think we could describe as
Comfortably middle class.
sufficiently,
Yeah.
yeah, sufficiently prosperous that they were middle class, and
Yeah.
children could expect to do at least as well as their parents.
Yeah.
So we have, on the one side, of course, this crisis of economics, in which we've seen this kind of economic populism that once upon a time we might have thought of as a kind of left economic populism, ironically
Mhm.
enough, kind of desire to improve manufacturing, tariffs, which have gravitated between the left and the right, protecting American workers from cheap labor markets and so forth, trying to correct the trade imbalance. So there's the economic side of it, and then there's the kind of the very connected but distinct social side, and that touches on things that you just mentioned. So
Okay.
the growing fragmentation, especially as we look at differentiation of classes. These are things that Charles Murray wrote about in his book
Mhm.
Coming Apart. The lower you are on the economic scale in America, the more likely you have family dysfunction, social dysfunction, kind of inherited forms of dysfunction that are passed on from one generation to the next. And this is now, it's not just, it's not a racial thing, it's not an ethnic thing. This is now just really a class phenomenon
Mhm.
that's pervasive. And of course, J.D. Vance is a good exemplar of someone who grew up in those circumstances, and quite
Mhm.
miraculously
Mhm.
was able to sort of pull himself out of it with various forms of assistance. But most
Right.
people have not been able to pull themselves out of this. And
Right.
so JD is not someone who's saying, well, we can just all just pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. He's someone
Mhm.
who's articulating, look, this is systemic and needs a
Yeah.
systemic solution. So
Yeah.
I would say broadly that if you think about what are the advances of liberalism, well, of course, it's the economic liberalism on the one hand and social libertarianism on the other, which fails to be able to speak to this kind of this crisis of relationships
Mhm.
the
Because it
form
prizes individual liberty so
exactly.
much,
So so the
and
left
liberty understood as just release from all constraints, release from all limits.
yeah, the left is unable to speak about it. The right talks about family values, but it's kind of in its own way, it's libertarian, which is that if we can just civil society can sort of just heal itself. And I
In
think
the
we're
end, those values tend to get support, and I'm going to be I'm generous and charitable here. Like, tend
yeah,
to get subordinated to sort of what are seen as sort of ironclad laws of economics, basically,
yeah.
right?
I mean,
It's
not a
like in the
Marxist.
end, though, what
Yeah,
can we do? It's
yeah,
sad.
but they're connected. They're
Yeah,
deeply connected, and let's
yeah,
we have to recognize that. So the right has been, of course, at least since Reagan, if not earlier, has been very concerned about family values, civil society, religion, and in some cases thought about how do we think about supporting that. I think this was part of George W. Bush's efforts for kind of a
thousand
the
points of light.
that was George H.W. But
Oh, sorry, yeah, W,
yeah,
yeah.
George W. Bush, the kind of office of what
Oh,
was it?
alphas of faith-based
Faith-based. Yeah, so I mean,
something or
thinking
other.
about the ways that the public order could support
Yeah,
religion, and
right.
that was a move in that direction. It was, in a way,
Mhm.
stillborn, but at any rate, I think we're well past the point where we can sort of just comfortably believe that civil society can now heal itself of its own accord, and this is why I think we're in a post-liberal moment. Now,
Mhm.
what that looks like, I think there's a lot of post-liberalisms, and my book was really
Mhm.
just one effort to describe what
Yeah,
I would hope to see
yeah.
how that would unfold. But there are some very scary post-liberalisms out there. I
I
won't.
was just gonna say they're not all, attractive.
No,
And it's important, I think, for people to hear you say say that. It's not like, any post-liberalism is better than liberalism is not the
yeah,
case.
no, that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
And no, I hope, yeah, I hope by this point maybe people are hearing that. But yeah, it's I do think that there was a period of time around the time that this book came out that there was such a panic about the crisis of liberalism that anyone who was open to and writing about in a positive way, a kind of post-liberalism, it all got collapsed into one sort of horrific ball of
Yeah.
kind of house
Yeah.
of horrors.
Right.
And in fact, charitable readers recognized that I was at the very least trying to not only point in a certain direction, but provide a potential corrective to some dangerous tendencies in our
Yeah,
politics.
that comes through in the book. That definitely comes through in the book for those who will actually take time to read it. Let's go back before we get into like all the what to be done stuff. Let's go back to the founding. Since this season, we're sort of loosely tying these conversations to the semi-quincentennial. Um, your your telling the American founding is you correct me if I'm wrong about this. I'm going to say this, then you tell me, Jeremy, that's not quite right.
Mm.
And you're telling the American founding is fundamentally liberal, kind of in the sense that the framers are enthralled to what they would be called a new science of politics in their
Mm.
day, the new science of politics. And so they didn't create the kind of mixed constitution, a very key term for you in this book. I think one that doesn't enter so much into your writing and thinking before this book. You can correct me if I'm wrong about that. The kind of mixed constitution that the great sort of ancient and Christian thinkers sort of always recommended, where the few and the many are both represented in the Constitution. I think is kind of the idea, and that your one of your criticisms of the founding is that that isn't taken into account. That the sort of this new science of politics can transcend that ancient dichotomy. Am I saying this correctly? Is that sort of what your take is?
Yeah, of course, and this is in part because of certain things I wrote and argued in the previous book, Why Liberalism Failed. Certainly many people who are deeply, deeply sympathetic with and spend their lives studying the American founding regard me as a kind of apostate, not just a
Mhm.
heretic, but an apostate, someone who's been identified as a good, solid man on the right and who wrote
Mhm.
critical things about the founding fathers, which is
Mhm.
not permitted, I suppose.
Mhm.
And if I were to go back and rewrite parts of Why Liberalism Failed, I would make clear that I was what I'm criticizing is not every aspect of the founding generation, or
Hmm.
every aspect of our Constitution, or every aspect
Hmm.
of the founding fathers.
Hmm.
In fact, over time, and having been involved in a lot of conversations since the publication of that book, what I was mainly criticizing was a very tendentious reading of the
Got it.
Constitution that has become especially dominant on the right.
Okay.
Now, are the ingredients of that tendentious readings there? Yes, they're there,
Right.
and those have been overemphasized at the expense
Hmm.
of a lot of other elements that were present at the time of the American founding, and even in the writings of the founders, and even writings and arguments of certain figures in the founding period who tend to be overlooked. And you know well, Jeremy, that I'm pretty fond of many of the anti-federalist
Right.
authors who were critics of the Constitution, but you could say, I think, friendly critics
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
most
Patriotic critics of the
patriotic
Constitution.
critics, and they
Yeah.
saw that there were dangers, kind of almost like landmines that had a danger of going off. Among them was centralization. Among those was a kind of the rise of a certain kind of elite that would be
Mm.
selected for positions in the federal government, the loss of connection to ordinary people. I mean, it's so
Hmm.
really prescient
Yeah.
criticism of the Constitution that wasn't even ratified at that point.
Yeah.
So I would count those among the voices that are due our attention and respect. And in fact, in certain ways, it was in response to many of the concerns of the Anti Federalists that James Madison proposes the Bill of Rights
Sure.
in the first Congress.
Yeah.
So, in many respects, the part of the Constitution that most Americans now think is the Constitution is
Is a
due in significant part because of the arguments and critiques that were made by the Anti-Federalists, and
yeah.
Madison regarded those as serious and needing redress
Hmm.
in the
Yeah.
through the amendment process. So
Right.
all that said, let me get to the
Yeah.
heart of your
No, that's fine. That's
yeah
great.
yeah get to the heart of your question, which is that the this tendentious understanding of the Constitution, and in particular a reading of our founding fathers that emphasizes the liberalism of figures like Madison, Hamilton, and others,
Jefferson. Yeah.
and Jefferson, and by
Yeah.
liberalism, especially the kind of Lockean tradition that emphasizes individual rights, that
Hmm.
emphasizes an understanding of liberty that is very modern in its form, that
Hmm.
stresses liberty as defined as the absence of external obstacles to the
Hmm.
realization of our desires.
Hmm.
That's present, that's there, and over
Hmm.
time, it's that aspect of liberalism, or the liberalism of the founding
Yeah.
fathers that I'm quite critical of. But I think more than the founding fathers themselves, and here I think it's really an argument over the nature of the founding that I'm engaged
Mm.
in. What's really needed is a corrective to this. Again, I think a reading and an understanding of the founding, and frankly of America, that doesn't match the reality of the American experience, either the founding generation or the history of
Mm.
America, which has not been nearly as liberal as the
Right.
as that tendentious reading has tended
But when
to
you
lead.
have that tendentious reading, you're always pushing toward further liberalism, right?
Yes,
That's the problem. It hasn't been as liberal. Somebody might agree, and that's the
yeah,
problem.
yeah.
And
I
that's
think that's right. I think
right.
that's right. So
That's why we're
in
always
this
remaking.
way,
You know, with Ordo Seclorum language comes in. Like, yes, we're always remaking. We're
that's
always
right.
um,
So
moving toward asymptotically the perfect liberty.
here's one of the interesting realizations that came to me, is that as I myself was coming to realize this was actually the nature of my critique and response to many of my contemporary interlocutors,
Hmm.
uh, they are engaged in a kind of sleight of hand, which is that on the one hand, they claim they seek a restoration of the
Hmm.
American founding. But in fact, they are seeking, in a way, a form of America that never existed, or that if it has existed, it existed very briefly in the late 80s and early
Hmm.
90s. So
1780s,
it's
1790s, not 1980s and 1990s to be clear.
no 1990s.
Oh, okay, okay.
There's no desire on the part
Yeah.
of these founderists to go back to the 1780s. They'll be the first to tell you, well, okay, we weren't a truly free
You
and liberal.
mean like post Cold War
Yeah,
American
post-Cold
hegemony
War,
kind of got it. Okay.
end
Okay.
of history,
Yeah.
of
Right.
liberalism riding high. I think
Got it.
it's a projected nostalgia from a couple of decades of American history back to the founding and
Mm,
saying that's what we want to go back
I
to. But
see.
in fact,
Yeah.
no one will actually say we can read the history of the 1780s and say that's what we want to be like. So
Yeah.
there's a kind
Yeah.
of projection of a philosophical worldview onto an historical moment. And I think
Yeah.
that's, again, it's part of this complexity of the American founding, that what is it that we're actually wanting to revive or restore? Is it,
Hmm.
no one's saying we should go back and have chattel slavery, and
Right.
that
Yeah.
and many don't
Yeah.
want the economic system that existed at the
Hmm.
time. I
Hmm.
would argue,
Hmm.
of course, the court has. So I think there's a way in which the claim about the founding is serving, of course, a very set of contemporary needs and demands, and I think we just need to be clear about that.
One of the things you argue as well, and it'd be great to have you talk about on this podcast in particular, is how these ingredients that are present, they're not the whole story of the founding, but they're present at the time and in the minds of some of the framers. Is that the logic, this liberal logic, erodes? It's interesting. It seems to me, it sort of at one and the same time, it sort of creates space for independent civil society, and then ironically also erodes the institutions of civil society that could fill that space over time.
Mhm.
Family, church, voluntary association, that kind of thing. Can you explain that dynamic a little bit?
Well, of course, I think many again, of my interlocutors, who lament the development of American sort of political order, view, for example, they view the intervention of the progressive movement, or the rise of the progressive movement, and especially liberal jurisprudence, but not only liberal jurisprudence, as the main driver of centralization of government,
Mm,
the extension of government activities into nearly every sphere of life. And um, for that reason, the weakening and increasingly intentional weakening of institutions like civil society. I mean, the weakening of the states to start with, right?
mhm,
As
mhm,
opposed once
mhm,
what was supposed to be the sovereign nature of the states, the weakening of civil society, and then reaching down into those most elemental of institutions, family and church, where we're seeing
mhm,
an extraordinary crisis. And I think that telling is has a lot of legitimacy, and the progressive movement is most certainly uh, aimed at weakening identification with the states. I mean, you read
mhm,
Herbert Crowley, and Herbert Crowley, that's funny today
mhm,
to hear progressives as critics of nationalism, because someone like
mhm.
Herbert Crowley is the nationalist, along with
Right,
Teddy Roosevelt. The progressives were nationalists, but only in the sense that they wanted to move people's allegiance away from their localities to
right.
what they saw as the most comprehensive political unit at the time. So today's
Uh,
progressives are really the heirs of
yeah.
this same, you could say, the same trajectory, which is to say,
Hmm.
now the nation is too confining, and now we have to
Yeah.
think of ourselves as sort of global citizens. So
Yeah.
there's a logic there. Again, to talk about this liberal logic,
Hmm.
with these critics, and I share this, absolutely share this critique of the progressives. I am no fan of the progressives
Hmm.
or Dewey. In fact, if you know my work,
Yes.
Dewey's kind of one of my bête noir. Dewey and John Stuart Mill rank equally high
Yeah.
in my sort of pantheon of nemesis.
Yeah. At least you could read John Stuart Mill. I mean,
You
Dewey's
can't. I mean,
unreadable.
Dewey really is. Yeah. I published a long chapter on Dewey in a book that preceded Why Liberalism Failed, and a
Yeah.
friend of mine said, "You took one for the team. Read it all." I said, "Yeah, that's true." At any rate, but where I differ from the critics, the kinds of critics you find, for example, at Hillsdale College, who I think are
Yeah.
quite correct about their critiques of the progressives,
Hmm.
is that I don't regard progressivism as a kind of a fundamental betrayal
Hmm.
of the kind of liberalism that you see, again, this kind of tendentious
Hmm.
understanding of liberalism at the
Hmm.
time of the founding, so
Hmm.
much as I see it as a kind of development out of
Hmm.
core aspects of liberalism. So
Hmm.
if liberty is defined as the freedom of the individual to be as free as possible from the any obstacles that might limit our exercise of individual freedom,
Hmm.
then it turns out, so at the beginning, this is going to be, it's going to be manifest as potentially a fear of centralized government. But it turns out, as John Stuart Mill rightly notes, and as Dewey rightly notes, a lot of the limitations on our liberty don't come necessarily from the state. They come most immediately for most of us from things like family and church and community
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
states.
Mm-hmm.
And so the movement of progressivism was really, in a way, you could say, the belief that the best, in a sense, the institution that would most secure our individual liberty would be increasingly the centralized state by weakening those institutions. This is an argument that Robert Nisbet makes in his great
Yeah.
book, The Quest for Community, that the centralized state becomes the means of liberating us from these sub-national institutions
Right.
in the name of liberty. Of course, the irony, as
Yeah.
Nisbet noted, and he's building on Tocqueville, is that this then becomes itself a kind of form of tyranny. But it was
Right.
a tyranny done in the name of liberation. And
Yeah.
that's the paradox of liberalism, is that
Right.
as it liberates us from these kinds of institutions that are formative and authoritative, and they do constrain our individual liberty,
Mm-hmm.
the state, and then, as we see, international institutions take on these features that become oppressive. But notice the form of oppression is often against institutions and people and worldviews that want to defend these authoritative institutions. Right. So
Yeah.
where have we seen the most exercise of oppression today? Well, it's
Mm-hmm.
against religious believers and people who believe in the autonomy of
Yeah.
local communities. The
Yeah.
Catholics who are showing up at school board meetings and declared as domestic terrorists.
Yeah. People
Because
praying outside abortion clinics.
people praying out. Exactly. So this, but
Yeah.
notice what's happening is that
Yeah.
the power of the state is being exercised to suppress those remnant elements of society
Mm-hmm.
that are, you could say, arguing against this full developing logic of liberalism.
Hi, I'm Chris Kittemeyer, CEO of AmFell. I'm excited to share that this season of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers podcast is sponsored by AmFell. Whether your nonprofit needs help raising major gifts, building your donor pipeline, or crafting a winning fundraising message, AmFell has the expertise to help your organization thrive. We work with mission-driven organizations across the country to help them raise more money and advance their mission. Learn more at amphil.com. That's AMPHIL.com.
I think this is one of the great insights you have in the book, and that you can't sort of say enough. It's sort of like we have this weird thing happening. It seems like it's kind of new in the world, maybe not entirely new, where there's an elite, clearly. There's a few and the many, to put it in your terminology, the Greek terminology. There's an elite and sort of the masses. And the elite sort of refuses to see itself as an elite.
Yeah.
Right. And it's always it identifies oppressors. That's not an oppressor class. It identifies oppressors who are in fact powerless out there, people, praying in front of abortion clinics, whatever it might be, and says, that's your oppressor.
Right.
We must extirpate them. You must suppress them in the name of democracy. This is a unique dynamic, this way that the elite kind of masks its eliteness from itself.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah. So this gets us into some of the core arguments of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the nature of this contemporary, this modern elite. And, this is, let's face it, we're both members of this elite. We're both members of the, what was it?
You more than me, but still.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess I have a prestigious university, but still you make your living with words and ideas.
I do. Yeah, right. I move words and numbers around to call that work.
Yeah. We're the what Robert Reich called the cognitive elite.
I think symbolic analysts. I think
symbolic analyst.
Right?
That was,
and I only know that I just read the book. Your book again. That's a really great term.
Yeah. This was from his book Work of Nations, back when he was a fairly sensible guy. Center left guy.
Yeah.
Anyway, but this we're seeing this really fascinating phenomenon that I think is a way in which we can see that our broad constitution, I'm not talking about narrowly our written constitution, but the broad constitution, in the way in which I mean, so the word constitution is one of the ways that you can translate the Greek word politeia, which is, broadly speaking, the word for everything that falls under the rubric of politics. And another way you can translate that word is regime. And that's the meaning of that word when I use that in the title, and that's something
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of the people who read the book missed. Is
Right.
that I'm not speaking of overthrowing the
The
government.
administration. Yeah.
Right. You
Right.
know, it's really actually. I think I said in my opening speech when there was a book event, the book launch event, I said, I'm not seeking the overthrow of the government. I'm seeking something far more revolutionary.
Right.
That would be,
Yeah. Yeah.
as we know, America's, it's pretty easy to overthrow governments with something like the American military. It's really hard to change a regime, though. It's
Yeah.
really hard to change the nature of a regime.
Mm-hmm.
So regime change is really an argument that what we have now increasingly is this liberal regime, which produces this very elite that we were just describing. It is an elite that advances through every means, both political, but also importantly, non-political, sub-political institutions, through the
Mm-hmm.
shaping and forming of institutions, of course, like universities, media, entertainment, what books are published, what novels get published, in every domain that,
Yeah.
to think in an Aristotelian way, the regime is comprehensive and will have the tendency to shape every institution. Even when we think of the mainline churches, as
Mm-hmm.
where they have gone, they've been shaped by the regime. I mean,
Right.
it's a sad fact that Christian institutions sort of conform themselves to the logic of
Yeah.
sort of a liberal order. And so every
Yeah.
one of them now has a rainbow, obligatory rainbow flag that
Yeah.
is a symbol of their fealty to the regime. I mean,
Right.
a religion
Not a
founded by
cross.
someone who is not known for his fealty to the regime, as we are now entering, Holy Week and
Yeah.
about to
Mm-hmm.
both lament and celebrate the crucifixion and death of Jesus. This is
Yeah.
not the sign of submission to the regime. So
Right.
even the institutions that supposedly are to give us a kind of ballast have completely been reshaped. So this is a
Mm-hmm.
very powerful shaping force in our world, and it has produced a leadership class that understands at a very deep level that the greatest potential source of resistance to its constant advance of this liberationist movement and this progressive worldview are the kind of ordinary citizens who they claim and recognize as their fellow citizens,
Mm-hmm.
but they regard as a kind of almost a dangerous fifth column within our own nation.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the efforts of this elite increasingly are oriented toward delegitimizing them. As you stated, that delegitimation comes in the form of claiming that they are the oppressor class. So you have, white, Christian, heterosexual men who might be unemployed, underemployed, living
Mm-hmm.
in abject poverty. The oppressors defined against, whatever the opposite is, who have cushy jobs at Harvard University, who are now the oppressed. And this,
Right.
this is the deep irony that we've lived through. And everyone, I think increasingly people recognize this as a lie. But
Mm-hmm.
certainly at the time I was writing this was the kind of dominant
Right.
paradigm in which, sort of the rulers and the ruled were operating under.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how one, in a sense, creates the strategy by which every last remnant of a kind of functioning civil, familial, religious institution is ultimately gutted in the name of liberation.
Yeah. Talk about the 4-part box. It's very helpful, I think. You're not usually a graphics guy, so I was like, oh, this is a nice. It's very useful for helping understand the differences between progressive, liberals, Marxists, and conservatives. Those are kind of the 4 squares in this grid, this 2x2 grid. Do you mind kind of doing your teaching thing and explaining that to people?
Yeah. I realized not just writing this book, but over the years teaching these various traditions. So the 4 traditions are broadly classical liberalism, what we once called conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
So classical liberalism, progressive liberalism, Marxism, and proper conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
That one of the ways you can sort of divide these is, or sort of categorize these is, and these are, you could say 4 of the very main fundamental worldviews that are operative in the modern world. And so this naturally lends itself to the political scientist's favorite tool, which is the 4-part box.
Yeah.
by which you can begin at least roughly to draw some distinctions. So
It's a consultant's favorite tool as well. I'd like to point that out.
Yeah, I was putting my political science hat very briefly. I'm normally a
Yeah.
political theorist.
Yeah.
And so the four, I mean, it might be helpful if you want to do this post-production, throw up a
Yeah.
picture of the
Yeah.
grid. But if I'm remembering kind of the ordering correctly, on the left axis you have, actually let me start.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the left axis you have a kind of attitudes of fear and trust toward ordinary people.
Right.
And then on the upper axis, the sort of horizontal axis, so that was the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, you have two ways of seeing ordinary people, one of which is that the ordinary people have a tendency to be revolutionary or disorderly. And the other half of the horizontal axis, you have the view or assumption that people tend to be conservative. They prefer and desire order. And it turns out that these four boxes, turns out that I think become ways in which you can sort of differentiate these different understandings, these different kind of political
worldviews. Yeah.
Maybe the most controversial one is the upper left, which is viewing the people as revolutionary and therefore having kind of a fear or nervousness toward ordinary people. And this is what I claim is the stance of classical liberalism.
Right.
I think many critics of the book argue that was not the case. That classical liberals, some like Hayek and Price theory, there's a great trust in common and ordinary opinion as a kind of function of how you get feedback from the world. But where I think you see this mistrust of the revolutionary nature of ordinary people is once you move beyond Price theory, you see that there's always the fear and danger that the people are envious and resentful towards successful people. And of course, classical liberalism is premised on the idea that we are going to allow and indeed, in certain ways, encourage natural inequalities, particularly economic equalities, to emerge. And the argument that's made is that this is to the benefit of everyone in the society. So you'll hear arguments by classical liberals, Deirdre McCloskey, that everyone is better off under a classical liberal schema, financially, economically is better off. We all have cell phones. We all have flat screen TVs now. We have automobiles. Yeah, okay. Some people have really nice automobiles and really big flat screen TVs and many flat screen, but everyone is better off.
Right.
But of course, this doesn't diminish the sense of resentment and envy that even in a better off society, financially, economically better off society, those who are less well off are going to feel toward those who are better off. That's constant.
Okay.
So one has to devise, classical liberalism devises many mechanisms for preventing this potentially revolutionary impulse from manifesting itself. And this is, of course, rule of law, court systems, protection of private property, police force that patrol private property, or increasingly private police forces that patrol, and permission of private police forces to patrol and protect private property. So this is what I mean. And in some ways you can say our Constitution in this tendentious understanding, this is how many classical liberals, of course, read our Constitution. And they rightly note the Constitutional Convention was called after a series of rebellions that were taking place among the farmers in Western Massachusetts. It was fear of the debtor class that was, going to bring pitchforks and kill the creditor class. Yeah. So that's there, and that's that argument. And so then in the next position, the next box to the right, upper right, which is a fear. Actually, let me. Let me.
Well, the upper right is I think you're right. The progressive liberal box.
Yes, progressive
people are conservative,
right?
And
so this is fear. Is fear of ordinary people, but based on a kind of opposite assumption, which is that ordinary people tend to be conservative, tend to be set in their ways.
Yeah,
and this is
prejudiced and things like that.
Prejudiced, right? That they're deplorables. They cling to their guns and their Bibles.
Right.
I mean, this is very much the recognizable progressive liberal playbook. And the thinker I really point to here as one of its originators is John Stuart Mill, who is really to go back to what we were saying earlier, is the figure who really regards social conformity and cultural norms to be the greatest danger against liberty. And this is what
society is the greatest danger against liberty.
is the tyranny of the majority, not the majority now manifest in government per se, but just in opinion.
Right.
So he writes of the most dangerous and insidious form of despotism being what he calls the despotism of custom. That's a direct quote from Mill. So that's the despotism that needs to be overturned.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of fear that ordinary people are actually really just kind of a force of conservatism. And this is part of the reason why, for example, in his book, Considerations of Representative Government, where he's writing about the rising success of democracy and majoritarianism in the world, he writes, really kind of extraordinary set of arguments for, on the one hand, the need to defend the right to vote, and the right to vote should be widely dispersed and recognized, but it should not be necessarily equal. And he argues that there should be a mechanism by which people who are more progressive, less likely to be caught up in the despotism of custom, they should have more votes. And so he lights on the solution being people with more education will get more votes. So sorry, Jeremy, I'll get way more votes than you do. Together, we'll outvote all those yahoos with high school degrees.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then in the lower left, I'll make us quicker now. Lower left, this is the view that the people are revolutionary, but a kind of belief or trust or favor toward this view of the people. This is Marxism.
Right.
And the Marxist view that the revolutionary impulse and instincts of the people will be the driving force of history. And in the book, I make mention of the fact that Marx is occasionally disappointed by the people. They're just not revolutionary enough. So he does smuggle in his own elite theory that then Lenin will, of course, draw out fully, which is that it turns out you're going to need a vanguard to sort of push
the cause of the false consciousness of the people.
Yes, exactly.
We need a vanguard.
Exactly the arguments for why the people are not living up to the theory.
Right.
And then the last box on the bottom right is this belief in the people that is informed by an assumption that they're conservative. And this is, of course, I think the genuinely conservative position. It's not classical liberalism. Genuinely conservative position is that holds the view, and I think this is frankly empirically the correct view, that ordinary people tend to, more than anything, prize a high degree of order and predictability in their lives. They don't have the benefits and advantages of wealth that can cushion, transformative, constantly, churning changes in society. What they tend to prize is ways of life that can be passed on from one generation to the next in relatively orderly fashion. I think describes, life in rural America for much, and frankly, small town America for much of our history. When I said earlier that America is not the nation that is often described in the classical liberal telling of the American founding, that's precisely what I mean. And I think that's what was recognized by our founding fathers as a fundamental, to truth and benefit of the American order that comprises our more comprehensive Constitution. That is our Constitution. And in many ways, the Constitution was meant to preserve that, but in many ways, it also, because it also was informed by this classical liberal tradition, there's an internal, you could say, debate within the American soul, and that debate was resolved in one way in the last number of decades. And the argument of my book is that this argument needs to be resolved in a different way, and frankly, a way that is true to ourselves. I'm not calling for a regime change that betrays our own tradition, but that in a way realizes the truth of our own tradition.
The deepest American tradition, and the one that's most closely tied to sort of the Christian civilization out of which it sprung. Is that fair to say? And you put Burke, to be clear, so this is the view that favors the people. It tends to think that the people over time have common sense, there's some wisdom encoded in tradition and custom. Custom isn't despotic. It's actually a transmitter of knowledge and so forth.
In fact, as you know, I have an entire chapter in some ways on common sense, and the deep meaning and significance of that phrase that all of us, we got whacked in the side of the head by, maybe our mom or dad said, use your
Yeah.
common sense.
Yeah.
Whack gently on the side of
Yeah.
common sense. And that has a deep philosophic origin, which is
Yeah.
precisely this conservative understanding that common sense is a kind of, as Burke himself puts it, it's a kind of deep kind of deposit of knowledge or a sedimentation of loam,
Yeah.
from which a kind of collective wisdom is stored. And
Yeah.
I just gave this lecture in my class the other day. We celebrate, or we have celebrated, that form of collective wisdom in various ways in our society. And one of the preeminent ways that I've taught on college campuses now my entire adult life, or lived on college campuses, it's in the way in which we have designed libraries on campuses to be the most beautiful, significant,
Mm.
often the most ornate building on campus, at least when they were originally built on the
Yeah.
older campuses.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
only in a progressive age that
Yes.
then we build new libraries that are
Mhm.
ugly and
Yeah.
thin and meant in some ways to demonstrate whatever this building once represented, we don't believe it anymore. So
Yeah.
it's a kind of betrayal of common sense.
Yeah.
So
That's
all
great.
these ways that we reflect on the deep value of institutions and how we, symbolize those institutions through our architecture, through the way in which we describe them, through mottos you put on top of it. I love the
Yeah.
University of Colorado. I'm teaching at the University of Colorado this year. The motto on top of the library, which was, a little bit older,
Mhm.
I don't want to mangle this, but it's he who knows only his own generation remains always a child.
That's great.
Yeah, I think I may have mangled. There's no he who knows only his own.
Yeah, there's no he anymore. Of course.
Something like
Yeah.
that. But it's who knows
Yeah.
only his own generation remains always a child,
Yeah.
which
That's really
which is a
um
remarkable
and
sentence.
germane to exactly what we're talking about here. There's a deep conservative understanding underlying such a motto.
Yeah, who would have
So,
thought? University of Colorado.
well, but they'll show that was a tradition that was operative, right?
Yes.
And it's less operative now.
It's
Um, but it just struck me though that you put Burke, Burke. This is the interesting part of what, and this kind of the nuance of what you have to say. Is that Burke thought of himself as a liberal of some kind, right? He was
yeah,
certainly a Whig,
yeah,
and I think it's important to understand that it's not like everybody who ever thought of themselves as a
yeah,
liberal is
right,
necessarily firmly in top left square.
right. Yeah,
There's
yeah.
a
No, and of course we're
beautiful
talking
tension there.
about and
Yeah,
Tocqueville would be in that
yeah,
bottom
yeah,
right corner as well. No, and Tocqueville, of course, described himself as a strange liberal.
yeah,
But
yeah,
we're talking about, of course, liberals and a liberalism that was drawing deeply on that classical
yeah.
understanding of what
Right,
defined
right.
liberals. So the
Yeah,
word liberal is a very ancient word. Right?
yeah.
It goes back to antiquity. You
Hmm.
find it in the Bible, right? Jesus says,
Yeah.
"I came to set men free." Right?
Hmm.
That's the
Yeah,
word.
yeah.
That's the Greek version of the word liberal. And there's, of course, the word liberty itself is Roman origin and
Hmm.
used often in Rome. But it meant something very different than the modern understanding of liberty,
Yeah. Right.
which is not freedom as a kind of
Yeah.
form of, uh, uh, liberation from obstacles.
Absence of all restraint and all
Yeah.
limits.
In
Right.
fact, as the Christian understanding, and again, as we enter
Hmm.
Easter, uh, the Christian understanding is that freedom is attained through a kind of self-government or self-discipline, right? It's the overcoming of sin. So in some ways you could say the definition is reversed in modern times, which is the more free you are, the more you can engage in what
Yeah.
used to be sin. Right? The more we're free, the more we can be sinful.
Yeah.
And of
Right.
course, it's a remarkable sleight of
Well,
hand.
God is the ultimate limitation, Patrick, right?
God is the ultimate
God is the
limitation.
ultimate sort of purveyor of restraint, right? In the liberal view.
God is,
So,
and nature's God, to use Jefferson's
yeah.
phrase. So
Yeah.
nature is, of course,
Yeah.
a radical impediment to our freedom. And,
Indeed.
see that one of the trajectories of liberalism today being absolute Gnostic hatred of the body.
Yeah.
The kind, and we see it, of course, in contemporary efforts to say that there's no such thing as gender.
Yeah.
Abortion is one of the
Yeah.
forms, but transhumanism,
Hmm. Brains and
looming,
fats.
is
Yeah.
looming right on our immediate horizon.
Yeah.
And this despising of the human body and its limitations is the ultimate, it is kind of ultimate rebellion against God if we are created.
Well, we just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
We should have a part two. Maybe we will have a part two at some point. But I highly recommend um, people to pick up and read Regime Change, as well as Why Liberalism Failed if they haven't, and read for themselves. Sort of very deep and very profound and nuanced argument here. This very sheds a lot of light, I believe, on our contemporary world and what we're going through. There's so much more to say. And by the way, if anybody's thinking like, yeah, but what are you going to do about this? You have like a lot of ideas in this book. No one could read this book and say, you're just a critic. You put forward a lot of practical proposals. I mean, details need to be worked out, of course, but about everything from dramatically increasing the size of the House of Representatives as a potential thing, certainly decreasing investment in today's higher ed institutions and increasing investment in trades. A lot of these ideas showing up domestic manufacturing. I didn't even have a chance to ask you about tariffs, but that's okay. We won't go there. All intended to, as you put it, and you could be your last comment if you want, better mixing, a more fruitful mixing of the few and the many, and getting away from this total bifurcation we have now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, to jump way ahead in the story, we have this ruling class today that pretends to be the oppressed, and that is,
or to speak for the oppressed, at least. Yeah,
it might be that now it's outdated because the ruling class is now on the run in certain ways. I mean, I don't. I think they're going to reconstitute themselves, and we're going to see a turn or an effort to return to power, and they still control some really important institutions, including Harvard.
Yeah,
we're reading about right now.
Yeah,
Harvard discovering its inner Hillsdale right now.
Yeah, vibe shift.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing. But at the end of the book, I argue that we really need to think practically about ways of mixing the various classes in ways that I think, not to be overly nostalgic, but in ways that I think were much more natural and given in this America we were describing, in which you didn't have this kind of concentration of elites into 5 cities in America and 5 universities where they would be sifted through, so that people would kind of come to know each other. And I think the basic thesis of the book is the mixed constitution, going back to antiquity, was always the way in which this danger of having either a dominant elite or a kind of surging revolutionary populist element in the society was best alleviated, was through this kind of mixing that had hopefully the effect of blunting the vices of each class and bringing out the virtues of each class, which are really quite distinctive. We've been talking about common sense, and I think one of the hallmarks of elites today is that they're not the bearers of common sense today. If anything, they're living in this kind of unreality.
Yeah.
So there are, but at the same time, a well-constituted elite recognizes it has a real responsibility to provide the kind of elements of life that are particular to those who are blessed with living in a more, let's say, elite or blessed condition.
Yeah.
Such things as elevating the tastes and culture.
High culture.
When John Adams, to go back to one of our founders, when John Adams writes his considerations on government, one of the things he underscores is that a liberal education must be provided for every citizen. And then he states, especially those in the sort of the work of hands. Not merely for those who are attending elite institutions, but especially for those who are, kind of under the demands of everyday workaday life, because a liberal education is the source and constitution of what genuine liberty is, right? It's the learning of liberty in that classical. And John Adams, maybe more than any of our founders, was well versed and very deeply steeped in that classical understanding of liberty. So that it's the kind of cultivation of a worthy elite and a worthy populace that brings about, I would say, a kind of an admirable political order or an admirable constitution. And that's really what I'm trying to commend in the course of that book.
Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick. Great way to to bring it home there. We had to skip about 150 pages, but we got there. Patrick is on. People can follow you on X. You still on X?
I am. I don't do much there. But
Okay. But you're occasionally there. Anywhere else where you would commend people to follow your work?
Yeah, I write for the Post-Liberal Order Substack with a couple of friends, Glad and Papin, you know. And, so I'm actually again, this won't be released for a little while, but I'm writing a little piece about my recent experience in Canada, with having an election in the very near future. And for that appearance, I reread a number of things by George Grant, and I am just blown away by how prescient he was.
He's great.
Just amazing. Yeah. Everything I just said, George Grant said it way better.
Wow.
You know, in the 1950s and 60s. So.
I don't know about that, but it is worth commending George Grant to people's attention. The great Canadian philosopher. Yeah. So wonderful.
So I'll be posting something there on Grant in Canada.
Great. Great.
Yeah, that's my primary outlet right now.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it. I'll see you in South Bend this summer.
Okay, great. I look forward to it, Jeremy.
Take care. Hey, thanks for joining us for today's podcast. If you enjoyed it, we invite you to subscribe or rate or review us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Thanks a lot.